Today, we're going to start a new series, Comic Books for Beginners. Stay tuned. Welcome back to My Third Life. I realized that a lot of my subscribers, being friends and family, don't know that much about comic books. And really, there's a lot I also don't know since I started as a teenager and then had a 30-year break. So I decided to start a series for beginners that contain some basic information. I've already learned a lot from making this video, and I hope you get something out of it too. At the end, let me know if you like this kind of information, and I'd be happy to make more. Let's start at the beginning. Basically, at least in this country, comics got their start in what's called the Victorian Age, where newspapers would run comic strips. It wasn't until 1897 that there was an actual book called Yellow Kid that was just a reprint of comic strips from the newspapers of the same name. And then several other books followed in the same format. And this began what we call the Platinum Age, which lasted until about 1937. Now, comic books as we know them today really didn't get their start until 1938 with Action Comics #1 and the introduction of Superman. As you can probably imagine, that first comic book is worth a lot of money. A recent auction of a CGC graded 6.0 called the Rocket copy, because there's a stamp of a rocket on the cover, recently sold at auction for over $3 million. So, if you have any grandparents or aunts or uncles or somebody you know that maybe has old trunks or boxes in their attic or basement, maybe ask them if they ever collected comic books. You never know what you might find. Now, the Golden Age introduced characters that we still enjoy today, such as, besides Superman, of course, such as Wonder Woman, Batman, The Flash, the original Captain Marvel, and Captain America. Now, the Golden Age can actually be further divided into what's called the Atomic Age, starting around 1949, as many of the superheroes lost their own titles as taste changed and other genres rose in popularity, chief among them westerns, crime stories, and horror. Now, the rise in crime and horror comics and their associated covers led to sort of moral panic, which ultimately led to Senate hearings about comics' influence on juvenile delinquency. Now, I know that sounds a little bit crazy and extreme, but personally, I can remember growing up with similar panics about song lyrics, which led to parental advisory labels, video games being accused of causing violence in kids, and who remembers the big satanic panic of the 80s where it seemed like every time you turn on the TV there was some talking head with a guest about the dangers of satanic cults and crazy sacrificial rituals, while putting much of the blame directly onto a game that many kids played called Dungeons and Dragons. Now, if you played Dungeons and Dragons and survived without joining a death cult, give me a thumbs up and let me know in the comments what you remember about these times. Now, to be fair, some of these comics of the time had some pretty graphic or even gruesome covers, such as Black Cat Mystery #50, Tomb of Terror #15, and Crime Suspense Stories #22. Graphic warning. It shows a man holding a woman's decapitated head after he presumably chopped it off with an axe. These days, there is actually a niche of comics collecting called pre-code horror. You'll understand what that means in a second. And many of these comics that are collected are from a company called EC Comics, who were actually responsible for some names that you might actually recognize. They published Tales from the Crypt with the Crypt Keeper, as well as the Vault Keeper and the Old Witch. The company would end up ceasing publishing of all of these titles, and we're left with only one called Mad. And here's why. In order to avoid government regulation, the industry agreed to censor itself, and the Comics Code Authority was born. Now, just in case you think the comic book publishers were overreacting, before the Senate hearings happened, there were actually bans of comic books taking place and burnings in several cities. So, in 1954, publishers would begin submitting issues to the Comics Code Authority in order to receive their literal stamp of approval. Now, while adhering to the Comics Code Authority was technically voluntary, distributors refused to deliver comics without the seal, with a couple of notable exceptions. Dale and Gold Key Comics, who purported to answer to a higher authority, that being Walt Disney, as they were responsible for publishing many Disney titles at the time. Now, the 1954 code criteria included bans on depicting crime or criminals in any kind of positive light, and forbade presenting government officials or institutions in such a manner as to create disrespect. Now, as to the horror comics, the crackdown included prohibitions on zombies, werewolves, vampires, ghouls, cannibalism, and torture, and actually forbade the use of the words horror and terror in the titles. Obviously, any kind of nudity was out, along with sex, smut, vulgarity, and words or symbols with an undesirable meaning, whatever that is. And interestingly, females should be drawn realistically without exaggeration of any physical qualities. So, yeah, you tell me if you think comic books have historically portrayed female anatomy accurately and realistically. Amazingly, Marvel Comics continued submitting comics to the CCA all the way up until 2001, when, despite several updates to the code over the years, there was an issue of X-Force that was rejected. So, Marvel just stopped submitting their comics. In the few years before this time, most new publishers hadn't even bothered to join the CCA, and advertisers no longer really checked to see if the comic had the CCA stamp before advertising. It took until January 2011 before DC announced that it would end participation, immediately followed by the last holdout, Archie Comics, a day later. Now, this golden age that started with Action Comics #1 in 1938 lasted all the way up until 1956, when a new Flash named Barry Allen was introduced in Showcase #4. And remember, many of the superheroes in the Golden Age had lost their own titles, so they appeared in books with other names. Now, this kicks off the Silver Age, where we have a resurgence of the Golden Age superheroes and the rise of Marvel Comics under Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, with the introduction of many new characters that, again, we still know today, such as the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, X-Men, and the Incredible Hulk. The Silver Age lasted until about 1970 and gave way to what is known as the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is generally accepted to start when the Green Lantern title became Green Lantern / Green Arrow with issue number 76. So during this time period, the Bronze Age, comics started to take on a bit darker approach, and the heroes were depicted as, you might say, more human. The Green Arrow sidekick Speedy developed a heroin addiction. Tony Stark, Iron Man, battled alcoholism. And the extremely controversial act, which is still felt today, when Hank Pym, yes, the same Hank Pym that's depicted in the Ant-Man movies, is depicted as actually slapping his wife, Janet Van Dyne, in The Avengers number 213. Now, to be fair, according to writer Jim Shooter, that was never supposed to happen. Yes, he was supposed to be mad at her and kind of just push her out of the way, but the actual slap was a miscommunication. But it happened, and it's still brought up decades later. Now, one of the biggest events in my mind, at least, was the death, or you could say, I suppose, actually the murder of Gwen Stacy. Now, she may have not have been a main character, but still, she was a longtime friend and girlfriend of Spider-Man, and the actions of the Green Goblin directly led to her death in Amazing Spider-Man 121 and 122. Now, during the Bronze Age, storylines also began to incorporate more social issues, especially pertaining to race and gender, and we saw a sharp increase in appearance of non-white superheroes such as Luke Cage, Storm from the X-Men, Blade, and Shang-Chi, among others. An interesting side note is that in 1971, the government actually approached Stan Lee to do an anti-drug campaign in some of his comics that would focus on the dangers of drug use. The story was actually rejected by the Comics Code Authority, which had strict rules against portraying drugs. Stan published it anyway, which ended up leading to a revision of the CCA's rules. After this revision is when DC published their story about Speedy's heroin addiction in Green Lantern, Green Arrow, number 85 and 86. As you can imagine, many of these issues that I've mentioned are still sought after today by collectors. Now, the 1971 revision of the CCA also relaxed the rules on use of vampires, ghouls, and werewolves, which led to more new characters such as Swamp Thing, Ghost Rider, Dracula, and Werewolf by Night. Now, for a brief time, the comic books actually moved away from superheroes again that had regained popularity in the mid-60s in favor of these new horror and monster titles, as well as a brief return to westerns. But it was short-lived, and by the mid-70s, they had returned to the superheroes. In 1975, Giant Size X-Men number 1 kicked off a renewed X-Men series after Marvel had spent the previous 5 years issuing reprints for that title. Now, this is also the time when Marvel began to really gain popularity and to overtake DC, who had been in the lead since the Golden Age. In 1978, DC nearly went under as they had released too many new titles at once and had also raised prices, overestimating demand. This actually became known as the DC implosion. So when exactly did the Bronze Age end, and what came next? Well, generally speaking, though, around 1985, 1986, when DC would publish their Crisis on Infinite Earths, which would overhaul the history of the DC universe and the history of several major characters, which revitalized sales and brought DC back as a major contender in the comic book market. This is also the same time that Marvel introduced their new Secret Wars storyline, which, interestingly enough, put into motion some things that are still major characters or plot lines today. So what comes after the Bronze Age? Most people just call it the Modern Age, but that doesn't really seem right to me or a lot of other people. We're talking about a 40-year period between the supposed end of the Bronze Age, 1986, and now. So some people refer to the period starting in 86 as the Copper Age, or even the Dark Age, as this is the time when darker themes in comics were being explored, not just with the characters, but with society in general. Starting off with Batman, The Dark Knight Returns, and The Watchmen. So-called anti-heroes such as Wolverine, Punisher, and a darker Daredevil were examples of good characters that were willing to do bad things to bad people, and they were growing in popularity. The 90s really, for a lot of reasons, in my opinion at least, should be their own time period. The style of the art, the storylines. Comic books really were at the height of popularity, at least for Marvel in the early 90s, as Marvel restarted several other series such as Spider-Man and X-Men, X-Force. New characters were introduced such as Cable and Bishop. And, of course, Marvel would capitalize on the popularity with action figures, video games, and even an animated X-Men series. Who remembers that? So Spider-Man #1, with art by Todd McFarlane, sold really at just an incredible 2.5 million copies. But they were quickly outdone by X-Men #1 a year later, which sold, and I believe still holds the record at over 8 million copies sold, which it turns out that a lot of people were actually buying multiple copies, myself included. I bought multiple copies of both Spider-Man #1 and X-Men #1, and they had multiple covers. It's kind of I wouldn't say the very first, but kind of the beginning of having multiple variant covers for the same issue. And so people bought multiple copies of multiple covers, like I did, speculating about the future value of these issues. Also, in the early 90s, we had Todd McFarlane, the Todd father, who, along with a few other artists, Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee, broke away from Marvel and started their own comic book company. Now, Rob Liefeld is credited with creating Deadpool and co-creating Cable. Once they broke away and created their own company, Image, it pretty quickly became the #3 comic book company, with Todd McFarlane really anchoring the company with his new creation, Spawn, which has had a continuous run from that first issue and still going today. Now, in the early 90s, DC also doubled down on the darkness when the villain Bane actually broke Batman's back. And then they did the unthinkable, really. I mean, they actually killed Superman at the hands of the monster Doomsday. Obviously, they brought him back. So, I mean, in comic books, seems like some characters die and you never know which ones are going to stay dead. Now, this time period, the mid-'80s to mid-'90s, is when I started collecting comic books and then ultimately stopped. I had some extra money during this time from summer jobs and whatnot. I also had a good friend who collected comics, and he actually wanted to be a comic book artist. And I'd spent a lot of time at his house and reading comics, hanging out, playing Super Nintendo. His mom was great. She'd bring us pizzas and cans of Pepsi, and we'd go over his latest book, How to Draw the Marvel Way. In fact, I may still have some of his original artwork that he did the pencils on, and I actually inked. So the last time I actually purchased comic books, as far as I can remember, is about 1995 when I attended a small comic book show where I was stationed on Camp Casey in South Korea. And then, when I got back home to the States, and then I moved out here to Washington, I ended up bringing my collection with me, and I've been dragging it around from place to place every time I move for decades. Now, right after I stopped collecting, Marvel actually suffered a major downturn, and as a result of kind of the collapse of all that speculation, they actually had to cancel many of their X titles and declared bankruptcy in 1996. So this Copper Age, it generally is thought to last till about the year 2000, when Marvel's fortunes would begin to rise again with the introduction of the X-Men movies. And really, a whole other episode, or maybe more than one, could be done on just the Marvel Cinematic Universe and how it's similar and different from the comic books. Now, beyond this Copper Age, there really isn't another widely accepted designation other than just modern age. I mean, I assume at some point they'll have to continue to divide things further. And I mean, as I said, there's a lot that's happened in the last 30 years. Obviously, the Marvel Cinematic Universe being born. And what I try to catch up on is I'm finding that in the early to mid-2000s, several of the titles were kind of rebooted. There was a whole all-new, all-different Marvel Now. It's a whole thing. I'm not even sure I understand it. Recently, one big change is that they've started over numbering their comics whenever there's a new story arc. A number one of an issue doesn't necessarily mean what it used to. But at the same time, they're also keeping a legacy numbering format at the same time. So, for example, like an Amazing Spider-Man number 6 is also a legacy Amazing Spider-Man 900. I assume it's just to allow younger people that are newer to comics to kind of feel like they got a place to jump in rather than trying to pick up a series at issue 900. So that makes sense, I guess. So to me, though, the really big change is, digital copies of comic books. Maybe we could even, this may end up being called the digital age at one point. I don't know. But, having 30 years to catch up on, there's obviously no way I can buy that many comic books, even from the dollar bin. It's just not possible. So I was actually able to go online to Marvel Unlimited. There is a monthly subscription, but I was able to catch up on I probably read several hundred comic books on that website, and caught up on some pretty major storylines like Secret Invasion and Spider-Verse from the mid-2000s. And the funny thing is, again, I mentioned the difference between the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the comic books. Many of the stories you see in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, whether it's on Disney Plus or the movies themselves, are taken from stories from the comics that are actually decades old. So again, that could be a whole episode or series on that. So this is where I'm going to wrap things up. This is already pretty long, and if you have any comments or questions, definitely leave them down below, and I will try to answer them. And if you like this series and you learned something, that's great. I plan to do more in the future, and I've I actually really learned a lot myself. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again.